Caleb Carter never expected to be anything more than a regular guy. He worked at Grills, the local fast food joint that served greasy burgers, watery fries, and all the sundry trappings of modern convenience. He didn't mind it, after all. Who needed ambition when you had a steady paycheck and no desire to get into any complicated situations? At least, that's what he told himself. After all, healing people with a mere touch could be a bit awkward. It wasn't exactly the kind of thing you brought up at dinner parties. Here's your burger, ma'am, and your Coke. Extra ketchup, Caleb said in his usual monotone, sliding a tray across the counter to the woman who ordered it. He gave her a quick smile before returning his attention to the grease-splattered grill in front of him. Another normal day, another dozen orders to get through. It was then that the old woman walked in. She was hunched over, a cane in hand, and her weathered face was etched with the kind of tiredness you saw on people who had been to the edge of life and back. Caleb was used to customers like her, grumpy, slow, and constantly correcting him when he got the order wrong. But today, something was different. The old woman barely said anything at all, just took a seat in the corner of the restaurant, watching Caleb as he worked. His shift was nearly over, so he figured he'd just leave her be. Then, unexpectedly, the woman called out, "Hey, you boy." Caleb looked up, half expecting a complaint about her fries being too cold or the ketchup not being the right shade of red. But instead, the woman's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "You're the one. The healer." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "The one who heals people," she said, tapping her cane on the floor for emphasis. "I've seen you before." Caleb furrowed his brow. He had no idea who this woman was, but he figured it was just some mix-up. "Ma'am, I think you're confusing me with someone else." She scoffed. "Don't be coy, boy. I've heard the stories. Touch someone, and they heal, right? Like magic." Caleb chuckled awkwardly. "Look, lady, I don't know what you're talking about, but if you want to report me for stealing fries, I'm afraid I'll have to call security." But the woman just sat there, staring at him with wide, knowing eyes. "You think you're just some regular guy, huh? Living your life in this greasy little hole, flipping burgers for people who couldn't care less. But you've got something special, don't you? You've been hiding it." "Okay, ma'am, I really don't have time for this," Caleb muttered, about to turn away when something strange happened. The woman's expression changed again, this time turning pained. She clutched at her arm, wincing. "Lady, are you okay?" Caleb rushed over, instinctively bending down to help her. The old woman's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Touch me," she said, her voice urgent. "You've got to touch me." Caleb hesitated. This was getting weird. But then, something in her eyes made him stop. There was a desperation there, something he couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said, setting aside his reservations. He placed his hand gently on her arm, and the moment he did, he felt it. A rush of warmth flooded through him, like a sudden burst of energy, and before his eyes, the woman's pain seemed to fade. Her tense shoulders relaxed, and her breath slowed. For a moment, the world went silent. Caleb's mind raced, his heart thudding in his chest. What the hell just happened? The old woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. "I knew it. You're the one. You've been hiding it, but now you've shown me. You'll never be able to hide from them." Caleb pulled his hand away, startled. "What are you talking about? Who are they?" The woman's lips parted as if to speak, but suddenly, there was a commotion outside the restaurant. A van had pulled up, dark windows obscuring the view, but Caleb could see men in black suits moving with practiced precision toward the door. The woman's eyes widened in fear. "You've got to go," she whispered urgently. "They're here." Before Caleb could react, the doors of Grills slammed open, and two agents, tall, sharply dressed men in black suits, strode into the room. Caleb's stomach dropped. He didn't know who they were, but the way they carried themselves screamed authority. They weren't just ordinary customers, Caleb Carter, one of the agents said in a low voice, his gaze sweeping over the room. We're here for you. Caleb felt his heart race as he glanced around, searching for an exit. He had to get out, fast. He turned back to the woman, but she was already gone, vanishing into the crowd as if she never existed at all. Hey! You! The second agent grabbed Caleb's arm. Come with us. In that instant, Caleb knew, this wasn't just about some fast food. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Without thinking, he jerked his arm free, sprinting toward the kitchen. He didn't know where he was going or what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure, he had to get out. Caleb's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, his sneakers slapping the concrete, the world around him a blur of streetlights and dark alleys. His mind was in a frenzy, the shock of what had just happened at Grill's still settling in like a weight on his chest. They were after him. The agents. But why? What did they want with him? What had he done to deserve their attention? The cold night air felt sharp against his skin, but he couldn't focus on that. The image of the woman's face, her pain vanishing in an instant as he touched her, burned into his mind. It was like nothing he'd ever experienced. Something inside him shifted, his gift, his so-called curse, was more than just a healing touch. It was a weapon. He wasn't just an ordinary guy with a weird talent. He was a target. He didn't know where he was going, just that he needed to get away from those men. He couldn't trust anyone. Not yet. He had to think, to breathe. It wasn't until he found himself standing in front of an old, run-down apartment building that he realized how far he'd run. The streets were quieter now, the noise of the city fading into the background, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own thoughts. He didn't know who to turn to, who to trust. He wasn't even sure if he could trust himself. But he had to find answers. The old apartment building was dark, its windows boarded up in places, the air around it thick with the stench of decay. Caleb didn't care. He pushed open the rusty door and made his way up the stairs, the faint sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. His heart was still racing, but he needed to think. He needed to stop and regroup before they came for him again. He reached the top floor and found a small, neglected apartment. The door was cracked open, just enough to allow him entry. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. It looked like no one had lived here in years. Hello? He called out softly, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. He stepped further into the apartment, his footsteps creaking on the floorboards. As he moved through the room, he saw something that made him freeze. On the far wall, a large map was pinned up. Lines, circles, and scribbles marked in red ink crisscrossed the paper, like some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. His eyes scanned over the names written next to various marks, names he recognized. Project Bound, that was the name the agents had mentioned, the name he'd heard in his brief encounter with the woman. But what did it mean? What was Project Bound, and why were they after him? Before he could think about it any longer, a voice cut through the silence. You shouldn't be here. Caleb spun around to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was tall, with short black hair and glasses, dressed in a plain jacket and jeans. She looked almost ordinary, except for the way she carried herself, like someone who knew exactly what was going on. Someone who wasn't afraid. I don't have time for this, Caleb said, his hand instinctively reaching for the door. I'm not here to cause trouble. Caleb Carter, right? The woman interrupted, her gaze piercing. You're the one they're after. He nodded slowly, his pulse quickening again. Who are you? My name is Nora, she said. Dr. Nora Chong. I used to work for them. Project Bound, that is. And I'm the only one who can help you. Caleb's mind raced. He didn't know if he should trust her, but there was something about the way she spoke, so calm, so sure, that made him stop. You're involved in this? He asked, voice tinged with disbelief. You worked for them? Not anymore, Nora said with a slight shake of her head. I've been out of the game for years. But they never really let you go. They always find a way to pull you back in. Pull me back in? Caleb repeated, still not fully understanding. What are you talking about? I just healed some woman at Grills, and the next thing I know, these agents show up and, Nora raised her hand, cutting him off. You don't understand. What you've got, your healing ability, it's not just some freak accident. You've been engineered. Caleb blinked, his mind refusing to process what she was saying. Engineered? She nodded gravely. They've been experimenting on people like you for years. Trying to create a new breed of human. Soldiers, agents, people with abilities that go beyond ordinary human limits. And your healing powers? That's just the beginning. Wait a minute, Caleb said, his head spinning. I'm not some science experiment. I've had these powers my whole life. I didn't ask for them. Nora's expression softened. I know. But you're part of something bigger than you realize. Project Bound didn't just create you, they shaped you. Your ability is part of a larger plan. A plan that's been in motion for decades. Caleb's mind raced. His whole life, he'd felt like something was off. But now, hearing Nora's words, it all made sense in a twisted way. He wasn't just a guy with a weird gift. He was part of a project. A weapon. So what happens now? Caleb asked, the weight of the situation sinking in. What do I do? We need to get you out of here. Get you to a safe place, Nora said. They're going to come for you. You're the next target, Caleb. They can't afford to let you go free. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. They're here, Nora whispered, her eyes locking onto his. You need to move. Now. Without thinking, Caleb followed Nora as she quickly moved to the window, pulling aside the blinds. Through the narrow opening, Caleb could see the unmistakable shape of a government van parked across the street. Men in dark suits were getting out, their movements methodical, precise. They were closing in. You have to go, Nora urged. They won't stop until they catch you. You have to get to the truth before they do. Caleb stood there for a moment, fear clawing at his chest. The life he'd known, working at Grills, living in obscurity, was over. In its place, a new reality had emerged, one where he was a hunted man, a pawn in a game much bigger than he'd ever imagined. He took a deep breath and nodded. Where do we go? Nora's eyes were resolute. Follow me. Caleb didn't hesitate. He followed Nora as she moved swiftly through the apartment, grabbing a small bag from the corner of the room. It looked like she'd been preparing for something, maybe an escape of her own. The urgency in her movements told him that time was running out. She reached the door and peered out the crack, her eyes narrowing. They're coming for us, she said in a low voice. But we've got a little time. Enough for you to start understanding what you've got, what they've done to you. Without waiting for his response, she opened the door and led him down the dark hallway of the building. The noise of the agents outside was growing louder. Their presence was unmistakable. Caleb could hear their heavy footsteps echoing on the ground floor, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer by the second. He had no idea who they were, how they tracked him, or even why they were chasing him, but everything inside him told him that Nora was right. His life, as he'd known it, was over. They reached the stairwell and hurried down the narrow stairs, the faint sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty building. As they descended, Caleb tried to steady his racing heart. His mind was still spinning. How had he gotten here? Why was his healing ability, something so natural to him, so important to these people? Nora didn't slow down as they hit the bottom floor. She moved with precision, like someone who had done this more times than she cared to admit. She led Caleb out through a back exit into a small alley, the cool night air hitting his skin like a slap. "You can't stop running, Caleb," Nora said, turning to face him. "You've got a bigger role to play than you think." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, feeling a tightness in his chest as he looked around, trying to get his bearings. The alley was narrow and poorly lit, but he didn't trust the shadows. He could feel their presence getting closer. "You're part of a project," she said, lowering her voice, "an experiment. You've been engineered to be more than just a healer. And Project Bound," she paused, her eyes hardening, "they'll stop at nothing to make sure you're under their control." "I know," Caleb said bitterly. "I don't understand any of this, but it's happening to me, isn't it?" Nora nodded, her gaze unwavering. "It's happening because of the work they did on you. The procedure, those experiments, they altered your DNA. You weren't just born with that power. They made you into something extraordinary. And now, they're trying to keep you in line." Caleb clenched his fists. The idea that his entire existence had been manipulated by some shadowy government project was almost too much to bear. He'd always known something was off about him, something different, but he never thought it was engineered. He just thought he was one of those freaks of nature. "You're not alone in this," Nora continued, her voice urgent. "There are others. People like you. People who've been experimented on. They've tried to hide it, keep it under wraps, but it's getting harder for them to control. You're not the only one with abilities." "Abilities?" Caleb repeated, his mind reeling. "I don't even know what I am anymore. What else do they have? What else can I do?" Nora took a deep breath, glancing over her shoulder as if she were expecting someone to appear out of the shadows at any moment. "They've created people with all kinds of powers. Some have telekinesis. Others can manipulate fire. There's one who can read minds. They're building an army of enhanced humans, and they've targeted you because you're the most valuable asset they've got." "They want me to be a weapon?" Caleb asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What do they expect me to do? Heal their soldiers? Fix their problems?" "That's what they think," Nora said, her voice thick with disdain. "They want to control you, use you to fix the things they break. But they're wrong about you, Caleb. You're not a tool to be wielded." Caleb's mind was a whirlwind, thoughts colliding. The agents outside, Project Bound, the mysterious experiments, everything was spiraling out of control. But as he stood there in the alley, something within him shifted. He couldn't just keep running. He couldn't hide forever. He had to know the truth. And to do that, he had to stop running from it. "What's the plan, then?" Caleb asked, his voice steadier now, the weight of his decision settling in. "Where do we go from here?" "We find the answers," Nora said, her eyes flashing with determination. "We find out who's behind all of this. And we put an end to it." They turned down the alley, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. The agents weren't far behind. Caleb's pulse quickened. He wasn't ready for a confrontation, not like this, not with the way things were unfolding, but he had no choice. He couldn't go back. Not now. Not after what he'd learned. The two of them moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. Caleb's senses were on high alert, his thoughts racing. There was no more time to figure out what was real and what wasn't. He had to trust Nora, even though he didn't know her. Even though he didn't know if he could trust anyone anymore. As they reached the end of the alley, Caleb could feel the pressure mounting. The agents were closing in, their movements fast and calculated. He heard the unmistakable sound of their footsteps behind him, and he knew they weren't going to just let him walk away. They were going to take him. He could feel it in his bones. They wanted him alive. They needed him alive, but he wasn't going down without a fight. "Stay close," Nora whispered, pulling him into a nearby stairwell that led to a second-story balcony. She gave him a quick, knowing look. "We need to keep moving. They'll try to trap us." They made their way up the steps, the sounds of pursuit growing louder. Caleb could feel the blood pounding in his ears. His heart was a drumbeat. He wasn't used to this life on the run, this constant fear, but he wasn't about to let them control him. Not now. They reached the balcony just as the first agent rounded the corner below. Nora pulled him back into the shadows, and for a brief moment, the world was silent again. The only sound was the beating of Caleb's heart, but that silence was shattered when one of the agents looked up, his gaze locking onto Caleb's. In a split second, Caleb's body reacted before his mind could. He reached out, his hand instinctively going to the agent's wound, a bullet graze on his shoulder. Caleb wasn't sure how, but when his fingers brushed the agent's skin, he felt the injury begin to heal. The pain receded. The agent's eyes widened in shock. "No," the agent gasped, as if in disbelief. "How?" Before Caleb could pull away, another agent lunged forward, knocking the first agent out of the way. It didn't matter. Caleb wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't just some tool. And now, with the truth about Project Bound in his hands, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He was going to end this. The sound of footsteps on the balcony forced him to look up. They were coming. But Caleb wasn't running anymore. He was ready.